Welcome, everybody, to my webinar on ADHD in 2022. Before I start, I'm going to talk a little bit about me, just to introduce myself and my background, and a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get started. First, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Karen Lowry. I am the creator of ADD Advocate. It's an online resource for families with children with ADHD. Professionally, I have worked as a pediatric nurse. I got my master's in nursing of children at University of Pennsylvania. I became a clinical nurse specialist and worked in various settings where there are sick kids and families who needed lots of support. So this genre that I'm in now is similar in that, you know, I am dealing with the child with ADHD, but I'm also dealing with a family. And that's exactly what I used to do when I dealt with sick children and their families. So it's kind of similar in that respect. So after marrying and after having 4 children, all of whom have ADHD, so I'm well aware of what you are living, I began to research ADHD, especially once I had my 4th child. With combined ADHD. So, you know, the combined ADHD is much more obvious when you're dealing with the impulsivity and the behavioral issues, which this webinar kind of points to, because I feel like a lot of times these are the kids that are getting in trouble and are told that they need to behave. And there's all sorts of issues around that as well, because I did live that with my 4th one. So at that time, I began to support him. I became a certified ADHD coach, and I helped many families as well as my own son. I know the struggles. I supported my son during all of the years in the school system, and went to countless IEP meetings. So I do understand the struggles of that and how scary it is. I can tell you that I remember my very first IEP meeting, just like yesterday. And multiple people were at a table, and there was me. And I would not recommend that for anyone, especially on your first time, to ever go to a meeting by yourself. And that's what I did. I learned the hard way, but that's okay. I learned down the road how to be the best advocate I could be for my son. Our kids with the right support can be successful. And I know sometimes you are probably wondering if that's possible, because I did too, when he was very young. But with the right support and the right support that increases self-esteem, our kids are very bright and they're very individual. Not one child with ADHD is similar to any other child with ADHD. They're all different. Sometimes I think that gets missed. And I think we have to always remember that every child, just like any other child, with or without ADHD, are all individual. And personally, again, I want to share, because this was quite a journey with my 4th child. Although I do say that all my kids have had ADHD, he was the most impacted in the school system and the most misunderstood. Now I have to tell you that he succeeded in college. He is now in a pilot school. He has achieved private pilot status and is on his way to achieving his goal of being a commercial pilot. Now, this is a child with previously significant behavioral and executive functioning deficits, a child who hated to read, a child who just couldn't adjust to any ADHD meds, so he was kind of on his own later on, a child who always exhibited impulsivity, boredom, and inattentiveness. This is the child now going through a rigorous program to become a pilot. And I'm telling you, when he speaks another language. It's so amazing. He found his passion, and all of your children can find their passion. But early on, he received support, and that support's critical because of so many reasons, really. I mean, support that allows a child to know that, yes, he may be different, like all kids are different. He's different in so many ways, but with support can learn about himself and adjust and succeed. And the biggest part of all is, as a result, have self-esteem. And with that, your child can soar. And that has been my child. He has been my project since he was born. And he is a truly amazing individual who has soared way beyond, I think, what I ever expected. I mean, I knew he could be successful, but he's pretty amazing in what he has done. So again, I wanted to reinforce that just because, of course, as a mom, I'm proud of it. And because I want you to know that I'm coming from a place where you are right now in all of the worries and struggles. And I want you to know how successful these children with ADHD can be with the right support. So just the boring stuff right now. Please be aware you can write any of your questions in the Q&A box. I won't answer the questions until the very end of the webinar. If I don't finish some of these questions, I'll just email you the answers because I've done that before. It just depends how many questions I have, but we'll do 15, 20 minutes of questions and then we'll go from there. And I think that's it for now. I think I'll start. So again, this is Children with ADHD in 2022, how to help your child academically and socially. So this is just a short overview of what ADHD is. It is a neurobiological disorder, a lack of neurotransmitters that carry messages across nerve synapses. And I don't want you to think, oh my gosh, what is this, a biological or a chemistry class? But I want to mention it always because so many people don't believe that it is a medical disability, and it truly is. An underactive prefrontal cortex, even though you would think that it might be overactive, it is underactive because of the lack of neurotransmitters that serve to control the cognitive functions, the focus, the planning, perseverance, work, and memory. All of the issues that are considered to be executive functioning are operated by the prefrontal cortex. And that is where our kids with ADHD have significant issues many times. With ADHD also, commonly, there's at least one comorbid condition like depression, anxiety, a learning disability, or OCD. The type of ADHD will determine the symptoms, although everyone, despite the diagnosis, is an individual, and therefore it will vary on how each child is impacted. I do think sometimes people think that if you hear the word ADHD, immediately the picture is, this is a kid bouncing off the wall, not behaving, not paying attention. And many times parents are blamed by that. Many times parents feel the guilt around that. And that is not the case. Every child is different. Depending on the type, whether it be the combined with impulsivity, inattention, or just the inattention piece. And of course, those are the kids that are harder to diagnose because they're not really obvious in the behaviors that they show. There are professionals in the ADHD community that would like to even call ADHD executive functioning deficit syndrome type thing, because that's exactly what happens with kids with ADHD. Emotional regulation is also a huge piece to this. Boredom, like I had mentioned before as well, which does create that inattentive piece, or it makes it worse, let's say, when there is boredom as well. And it really is physiological boredom. If our children don't want to pay attention to something they find boring, they're just not going to do that. So I focus a little bit on the behaviors because I see that so much in the families that have reached out to me and the struggles that they have in school, because they are expected to behave in the classroom and they sometimes can't. I also think behaviors reflect the frustrations that our kids with ADHD feel as they are impacted by these symptoms. So I think it's kind of like a dual thing. There's some behavioral issues, but I think it worsens because, again, another characteristic that I see over and over is, our kids are very intuitive and they're smart and they know when they're not measuring up to expectation, and they feel bad about themselves. So of course they're going to act out. Behaviors reflect our kids' perception that teachers and peers don't understand or accept them. A vicious circle ensues as performance goes down and negativity towards that goes up. Because of the nature of this invisible disorder, many believe that behaviors can be changed without support. I have heard families, I still remember this one client of mine who told me that his teacher said, all right, so now you're in 9th grade. It's time for you to get organized and behave and to listen. If they could do that, they would. Getting older is equated with maturity, and that's what was happening to this child. He's now supposed to be mature. Now, let's face it, 9th graders, whether they have ADHD or not, aren't mature anyway. But the expectation of being in 9th grade is that you can get your act together and you can do the things that suddenly you weren't able to do. Isn't that amazing? I don't know how that works. But that is someone who is not accepting ADHD as a disability for sure. And that's what we battle sometimes in the schools. This expectation, when it isn't met, only increases learned self-esteem. So you're not going to have any kind of improvement if the expectation surrounds things that you can't achieve. And so the vicious circle ensues with a low self-esteem. ADHD, invisible with causes under the iceberg. And that's the thing with our disability of ADHD. It's difficult to see. Outward behaviors like impulsivity and hyperactivity are seen, although maybe not accepted, but they are at least seen. But things like anxiety, executive function deficits, sensory issues, depression, low self-esteem, and OCD are not. The results of it are seen. And whether they're accepted or not, it just depends. I think many times not. Nor is seen the biological reasons for any. The reality of ADHD has hit home with many parents due to virtual learning. So the pandemic impacts, that awful period of time that we have gone through for the past 2 years, I guess kind of a mixed bag for our kids with ADHD. Certainly not anything we would ask for sure. But there has been some positive as well as negative. Negatively, of course, and the inability for your child with ADHD to stay focused on a Zoom screen, many times near impossible. But the other end of it is there was an increased awareness on the part of the parent regarding the struggles in the classroom. And I think that's the issue. Many times I see the breakdown of communication between home and school. So things are happening in the school and you don't know it. And many times it's just handled by the teacher, perhaps, or an administrator. Your child comes home and feels bad about it, and or they've just moved on and they've forgotten about it. And now they're back in the environment of acceptance. I think that in this case now many have seen their children learning at home and they see how difficult it is for them. The positive traits with ADHD, which I do have to fit in, and as I said before, they are very intuitive. They can hyper-focus on areas of interest. Just as I spoke about my son and being a pilot, there's massive amounts of hyper-focus there. Very sensitive, and that's a good and bad thing because, of course, they feel all the negativity around them when they're not successful. They're very creative, and they do see the big picture. The negative impacts of virtual learning, despite all of the positive characteristics: decreased self-esteem, unrealistic parental expectations, because again, the parents in many situations, didn't realize all of the struggles going on, or that they had any, maybe that they even had a basis because of an ADHD diagnosis. Maybe they didn't know that. They didn't know what was going on in the classroom. Emotional regulation. Sometimes our kids have a lot of problems with regulating their emotion and transitioning, which doesn't help the emotional regulation, but transitioning from A to B, or class to class, or situation to situation. Lack of peer interaction, and overwhelmed with homework and classwork. So that, of course, is a multitude of issues, whether it be that they didn't even have support 504 and IEP in place, or that now that it's virtual learning, it really wasn't being followed. Negative virtual learning effects, behavioral changes. Of course, you're going to have behavioral changes if you're frustrated, you're not with your friends, you can't focus on the Zoom. Your support may have been in place and not been followed. Depression, anxiety, missed assignments, decreased participation, failing grades, falling behind, increased opposition and school refusal, areas of struggle in comprehension, writing, and organization. In that area too, interestingly enough, our kids with ADHD can certainly have those issues, particularly of comprehension and writing, and not necessarily have a specified learning disability. And that is the tough part again as well. If your child, and 50% of our kids with ADHD do have some form of learning disability, if they have a language-based learning disability, they're going to have troubles like that. But if they are not diagnosed with it, and they're still struggling with it, I think sometimes there's confusion. It's very valid that our kids with ADHD have comprehension and writing issues. I think a lot of that probably has to do with their working memory. And working memory, again, is under that umbrella of executive functioning deficits. Working memory is holding ideas in your head while bringing in other ideas. So you can imagine if you're reading and trying to comprehend how difficult that could be, as well as trying to write without any kind of support, being able to pull from your head the different ideas and pull them together. So I think sometimes that is left out in the realization of our kids struggling, and not necessarily tied to a specific learning disability. And again, that's where they need support. Because for kids to be successful, they need to comprehend, they need to be able to write, they do need to be able to organize as they get older. The environmental impacts of virtual learning. So there's no classroom engagement many times. It just kind of depends on the teacher, I think. I know that I can also speak to this because my son, sadly, was in his 4th year of college in 2020. And so he suddenly was shut down and had to finish his senior year on Zoom calls. And I've talked to him many times about that. I mean, he had reached a certain degree of maturity and had a lot of support through those 4 years of college, but learning on Zoom was very, very difficult. He had a lot of trouble paying attention, staying focused. And the area here where I talk about no lack of notes, no PowerPoints, which many times impact learning due to the difficulty with the comprehension and note-taking, that was a huge issue for him. He said so many times, there were no notes. If you had an accommodation of getting notes, and in particular in college, which you can do, that was lacking in this environment, and no PowerPoints. So you're depending on following a professor's speech and writing at the same time. That's very, very difficult. I think that's difficult for a lot of us, but for a child with ADHD, that can be very, very difficult. And I think that is the major takeaway that he has, how hard it was because of that. The positive aspects now moving forward. Now, there's an awareness of the struggles, and those bring intervention with the school. So again, like what I was saying, Before, you may have had a child in school, diagnosed or not, support or not, and then you're seeing what's going on and during the virtual learning, and the realization hits you. And it could be, like I said, it could be a child with ADHD with support in place, and what's happening, maybe that support now you are seeing needs to be changed, or needs to be put in place, needs to be just modified in some way. Maybe, again, there may be a need for an evaluation of a current support. Maybe that's not needed, but maybe something is. How does the new data that you see, having seen your child being in school at home, how does that impact the need for change? And those are all the positives. As awful as the 2 years have been, some of the positives of realization on the part of parents and the increased need for communication with the school. And again, this kind of overlaps everything I just said, how parental involvement has changed. There's an awareness of the struggles, and obviously parents are aware in many instances. I'm talking about kids who maybe haven't been diagnosed or were, and maybe just started support. All sorts of issues could be in play here. But now they're seeing this lack of focus. They're seeing a difficulty planning out an assignment, let's say. They're seeing working memory issues. A lot of times they're seeing in math too, where you have to hold certain data in your head and manage other data, how difficult that can be. Boredom, how the processing speed, sometimes if you don't have notes and you're having a lot of trouble processing language at the speed at which the teacher is speaking, then you're not going to be able to follow it. So again, this leads to the involvement with school, questions around support that was in place, like I said, or should be in place. So there could be support in place, but it needs to be modified, or it could be there's no support in place and there needs to be support. This is an initiation of data collection in any area, whether or not your child has never had support or a child that needs to have modified support. Data collection is really crucial. Because it gives a lot of information as to what is going on and what would be more helpful to that child. And again, like I said before, need for the evaluation of current support. Enduring changes post-pandemic, increased understanding of how ADHD impacts learning, the individual struggles that do occur, the advocacy. Parental child, meaning the parent has now become a better advocate or strives to become a better advocate because of the knowledge that that parent has now achieved. With that is an increased self-esteem for your child. Demolish this vicious circle that I talked about. Post-pandemic, there are many changes now that can perhaps extinguish this vicious circle. It's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time, but it can happen. I feel like ADHD has been around a long time. It's probably made some moves to improve our children's lives, but I think there's an awful lot of misinformation out there that needs to change. And I think, not unfortunately, but that your child is, you are the number one support person to your child, and that child needs that. If you learn how to become an advocate, that child will thrive.